Nance, Trials of the First Slave Freed by Abraham Lincoln. A true story of Nance Legins-Costley, who lived between 1813 and 1873. Nance was known as a good soul, always willing to help her neighbors, and she worked her entire life in a boarding house as a hotel maid. Well-fed, well-dressed, polite, but still a slave. She was owned by Thomas Cox since birth in 1813. Cox was a rich and powerful man who was a founder of all three Illinois capital cities. As such, he moved his family and slaves every few years, building homes and businesses in each. In 1825, the Illinois Bank failed, and Thomas Cox went bankrupt, forcing a court-ordered auction of all his property, including Nance. An even richer Englishman, Nathaniel Cromwell, bought Nance for $150. Soon after, suddenly Nance screamed, because without warning, Nance was grabbed and seized by an old Indian fighter, John Howard, who had been named the county coroner. Nance refused to cooperate. She protested, resisted, and fought to get away. For being uppity, Nance was badly beaten, permanently scarred, locked in shackles, and dragged into an old lawn shed without food or water for at least 6 days solitary confinement in a hot and humid July. The Cox family sued to get her back. Since it was a public auction with witnesses, the presiding judge was Supreme Court Justice Samuel Lockwood, who later mentored young Abraham Lincoln. Justice Lockwood was the only avowed abolitionist on the bench. He allowed Nance to testify on her own behalf.
Cromwell, to serve him in any manner or form whatever, and is now detained and restrained of my personal liberty by him, against my will and consent. Therefore, praise the court to order that further proceedings may be had, as may be just and right, and that may conduct to a full and fair hearing of this case, and upon which Nance hopes to be discharged and released from the illegal restraint of Cromwell. Signed, Negro Nance, her mark, 6 October 1827. Springfield, State of Illinois, Sangamon County. Edward Mitchell, Justice of the Peace.
Nance lost the 1828 Supreme Court appeal. Meanwhile, 19-year-old Abraham Lincoln was on a flatboat trip near New Orleans. The two men tied the boat to shore, sleeping, then suddenly attacked by 7 club-swinging slaves, there to rob, kill, and sink the boat. Outnumbered 7-2, it was a vicious, bloody fight. Lincoln grabbed his favorite tool, a broadaxe, cut the tie rope with one swing, then turned on the slaves, who retreated into the water. Lincoln was severely cut on the scalp and bleeding badly. 20 years later, he parted his hair to show the scars to a friend. For Lincoln, slavery was now personal. Now, Nance and Lincoln shared something in common. Both had been scarred by the violence of slavery. For 15-year-old Nance, she lost her case and became Nancy Cromwell. By 1830, Cromwell had taken 17-year-old Nance to Tazewell to work for his new young wife in his new boarding house, where Nance met his business partner David Bailey and his wife Sarah, a daughter of the conductor of the Underground Railroad. Census showed that Nance was the only slave in town, but other Africans, freed and indentured, worked for the Cromwells, the Baileys, or at the riverboat landing. When the Black Hawk War erupted, Major Bailey befriended Captain Lincoln, introduced by his attorney, Major John Stewart. But disease, cholera, came downriver with the returning soldiers. The epidemic spread, killing many, including Mrs. Cromwell. Nathan was quite devastated, but he was also ill and decided to move south for his health. At 23, Nance was terrified to move south, so she got pregnant with a teenage black laborer and was too sick to travel. Eager to leave, the dying Cromwell made a hasty deal for Nance to work for the Baileys for $400 until he returned. Cromwell died in St. Louis a month later. With the Cromwells dead, 23-year-old Nance declared herself to be free, would only work for wages. The Baileys were going broke, so they agreed on a barter basis and set up an account. But legally, Nance was still a slave. A month later, Lincoln became a lawyer. When Bailey refused to pay the Cromwell estate, William Cromwell sued. Bailey's hometown lawyer lost the trial of Cromwell versus Bailey, 1838. So Bailey turned to his war buddy, and Lincoln agreed to appeal to the Supreme Court at no charge. In 1841, Supreme Court Clerk Isaac Arnold witnessed the trial and said Lincoln had prepared an elaborate case and that the Supreme Court reports was wholly inadequate. Lincoln referenced 3 different sources that repeated neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in Illinois, the territory, or the state. Then he used a Kentucky precedent that in the absence of proof, the color of the African is a presumption of slavery until proven otherwise. Lincoln attacked that logic and argued that Illinois laws were written without regard to color, and therefore presumption of freedom must prevail. Nance's contribution was the simple fact she refused to sign an indenture agreement as required by law. Therefore, no proof she was a slave. To add to the moral weight of a slavery case, court was held in rented space in a church. While the justices were familiar with the famous Somerset case in 1772, they had not heard Lincoln's last reference of English law 2 Salkeld 666 all the way back to 1701. Written in England, the common law did not recognize blacks as different to other people. Lincoln had won Nance's freedom for herself, her children, and every future slavery case in Illinois history.